Tearlaments is an archetype of dark aqua-type monsters that mills cards from the player's deck to fusion summon with the main deck monsters without using a fusion spell on either player's turn when they're sent to the graveyard. Each main deck monster has a trigger effect that activates when they're sent to the graveyard by card effect, like being milled from the deck. Rhino Heart is a one-card starter and extender that helps enable the other main deck monsters' trigger effects. Havness, Merly, and Sharon are the deck's fusion starters, as they all have fusion summoning effects that send the materials from the hand, field, and/or graveyard, including themselves in the graveyard, to the bottom of the main deck. The fusion monsters are the deck's boss monsters. Kid Kolos is the primary extra deck searcher and combo enabler, providing a triple threat of extremely powerful consistency boosting effects that kickstart all of the deck's major plays. Even having just one coffee is enough for the deck to function, and since she's level 5, you can cheat her out with instant fusion. There's a reason why she's banned in both the TCG and OCG now. Kaleido Heart is a 3-material offensive boss monster that has on-summon removal and a self-recovery effect that also dumps an archetypal card from the deck to the graveyard. Rulkalos is a 2-material defensive boss that provides battle protection for aqua monsters, a special summon negate that also dumps a Tearlaments card from the hand or face-up field to the graveyard, and a one-time only self-recovery effect. The spells and traps each provide one beneficial effect, then make the player send a monster from their hand, field, or deck to the graveyard. They also have 2 field spells. The first one dumps level 4 or lower aqua monsters from the deck to the graveyard. The other one searches a Tearlaments monster from the deck on activation, and has targeted card destruction when a Tearlaments monster on the field or in the graveyard is shuffled into the deck. Between the two, Primeval Planet Perloreno is the more desirable one, as its archetypal search and targeted destruction provide more advantage for the player. It's currently limited in the OCG, while Tearlaments Perlegia is not. Next, it's basically impossible to talk about Tearlaments without also mentioning the Ishizu Fairies, or as they're technically called, the Exchange of the Spirits series of cards. They're a group of 5 Earth fairy monsters that are retrains of really old monsters that Ishizu Ishtar used in the Duel Monsters anime. The Ishizu fairies form a deck-out strategy, with the intention of using Exchange of the Spirit to reduce the opponent's deck to 15 cards, and then use the Earth fairies' graveyard effects to get rid of those last 15 cards. At least, that was their original intent. But it was quickly discovered that these monsters actually turbocharge the Tearlaments game plan of milling cards for fusion summons and generating advantage on either player's turn. As a result, Ishizu Tearlaments became one of the most powerful Tier 0 decks in the game's history. Tearlaments themselves were already pretty darn strong on their own, but the Ishizu fairies took them completely over the top. Agado the Ancient Sentinel and Kelbeck the Ancient Vanguard's graveyard effects mill 5 cards from the top of both players' decks. Then, Agado mills 5 more cards from either player's deck if Exchange of the Spirit is in your graveyard, making a total of 10 milled cards. Kelbeck sets 1 trap from your graveyard for fulfilling the same condition. Keldo the Sacred Protector and Mudora the Sword Oracle have discard costs that special summon themselves from the hand. This discard cost can trigger Agado and Kelbeck's graveyard effects to mill cards if you discard them. Keldo and Mudora also have quick effects that banish themselves from your field or graveyard to target and reshuffle 3 or 5 cards from any graveyard back into the decks. This can recycle your Ishizu or Tearlament monsters back into the deck for more milling. The last monster, Zolga the Prophet, does not have any effects related to milling, discarding, or graveyard recycling, and is therefore not relevant to this discussion. There are also several monsters from other archetypes that work well with this deck. Since the Ishizu monsters are all fairies, you can use Herald cards, particularly Orange Light and Diviner, to both negate the opponent's plays and start your graveyard combos. Certain Shaddoll monsters, like Beast and Squamata, have graveyard effects that offer more consistency boosting when sent to the graveyard by card effect. Lastly, the Kashtira monsters have some synergy with Tearlaments thanks to the existence of Tearlaments Kashtira, which has effects that support both archetypes. As for playing against them, the best tactic is to either play Tearlaments yourself, or build your entire deck to specifically counter them, or you just scoop. But that's no fun, so here are some actual things you can do. Firstly, Tearlaments are all about setting up the graveyard for their plays. As you can imagine, they get no benefits from being banished. Dimension Shifter can instantly turn the tide in your favor if you don't rely much on the graveyard yourself, especially if you can use it at the start of the duel and stop the Tearlaments from ever starting their combos. You might also consider Necro Valley if you're already using Dimension Shifter and can afford to ignore the graveyard. If you can't afford to forego the graveyard, then other hand traps like DD Crow, Ghost Bell, and Skullmeister can help you out in a more precise, targeted fashion. Of the three, Crow is the most flexible since you don't have to chain it to a specific action the opponent takes. The level 6 Bestial monsters can also help with banishing since Tearlaments are mostly dark. Another good idea is to remove their Perloreno field spell. Cards like Cosmic Cyclone and Paleozoic Dinomischus can banish it pretty easily. Evenly Matched can quite literally level the playing field after the battle phase by forcing your opponent to banish their own cards if they have more cards than you. Floodgates are another good way to restrict Tearlaments from doing much of anything for at least one turn. Dimensional Barrier locks them out of fusions, Abyss Dweller can stop the opponent from activating any graveyard effects, and Soul Drain locks monsters in the graveyard and banish zone out of their effects. Shadow Imprisoning Mirror also works since the Tearlaments are mostly dark. You might also consider some obscure picks like Dimension Fortress Weapon or Earth-Shattering Event, to prevent them from milling cards. Lastly, Dark Ruler No More can negate your opponent's monster effects for a turn, and Super Polymerization can take away their monsters without them being able to respond. However, certain cards like the Bestials aren't in Master Duel just yet, so your options may be more limited. And the mirror match can often go to time with how many decisions both players have to make. All I can say is, best of luck.